memories.
What?
Just, experiences, what you or somebody close to you
And so give me an example. Like, all stories are composed of memories and experiences, right? But what kind of memories and experiences are in the war story for you?
Most of them being bad, bad experiences. Just because it has left a lasting impression on you. That where sometimes you just can't fully forget about it.
Okay, so you think a war story is something that leaves bad memories, bad impressions on the person who remembers, right? Other examples of war stories or definitions of war stories that you can think of? Yes, sir.
I think just the overall definition is just like two opposing forces going for, two separate goals. Pretty much whatever one side wants. Pretty much like I said, just two opposing forces.
So two opposing forces.
Yes.
Right. Why just two?
I mean, it could be numerous, but at least minimum of two opposing forces.
Okay. And they produce conflicts?
Yes.
Okay.
That, obviously both of them trying to achieve two completely separate goals.
Right. The philosopher Hegel has a definition for tragedy. What he says is that tragedy is not the conflict between right and wrong, it's the conflict between right and right. And that resonates a little bit with what you're saying. Because usually when we start to talk about wars and conflicts and things like that, what we usually find out, it's not that there's one side that thinks it's right and one side that thinks that it's wrong. They both think they're right. That's what makes the tragedy, right? Past wars, Vietnam War, current wars that we're engaged in, people in Afghanistan, the terrorists and so on, they don't think they're wrong. They think they're right. And that's why one of the reasons why we have intractable wars and intractable memories. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is the fact that wars are fought not just on the battlefield, but they're fought again in memory. That's why the Vietnam War still is important for a lot of Americans. It's been over for 40 years, but we still talk about it in memory again and again and again. And that's why many of you have had exposure to the Vietnam War, not through actually being there, but through watching other people's memories in movies, for example, or in reading books. So when we talk about war, it's very difficult to separate our discussion of what happened in the war, a war, from our memories of that war. Because for most of us, we've never been to war, or even been to a particular war. So with this example, all we're talking about are memories of wars. And so that's why we want to talk about how should we remember and why are memories important. Okay, so what other definitions of war stories or a war story do people have?
I think a war story is like what civilians are told by veterans. We were never really there to experience it.
Okay.
So basically, to civilians, a war story is just what we're told what happened, whether it's actually what happened or not.
Okay, so war stories are for soldiers to tell to civilians,
Yeah.
because civilians haven't been there.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other definitions? Any other definitions? So, yes.
I got one for you. By the way, my name is Johnny, glad to be here, and I'm here to observe, see someone else's side to the war. I was there almost half a century ago, 1966, and I spent a year there. And I think war stories, for the most part, are something that soldiers, ex-soldiers, Marines mainly, did the fighting, experience these tragic events, and that's where the mental disease of PTSD comes into place. We think about the bad things, and they affect us, the way we live, the way we communicate, and how we associate with other people, and deal with other people. And I think that has a great effect on someone's future as far as getting ahead or staying back in war. So I think war stories also are people who sometimes over-dramatize the situation, And we have unfortunately, some people that say they were there and they never were there. I think the statistics show that over 8 million men served in Vietnam, American soldiers and Marines, sailors and airmen. And in fact, I think only 2 or 3 million actually served. So those are war stories. You have to really look at the person's body language and pay attention to what they're saying and differentiate between reality and fallacy.
So we have on this one hand, this version of the war story for people soldiers who went and fought, experienced terrible things, and oftentimes have a hard time telling these stories, as Wes brought up, for example, right? We assume maybe. I mean, so one of the interesting things is that sometimes war stories aren't told because they're so traumatic, people don't want to share them, right? And on the other hand, you know, I run my own Vietnam War class at USC, and I have my students do interviews with people who've been through war and everything. One of the interesting things that I've discovered is that 2 million American soldiers of various branches fought in the military, right? So the random sampling of my class is that most of those people never saw any combat. So they were in the war, but nothing happened. They sat on a base or a ship or something. They didn't see anything traumatic. They didn't shoot anybody, nothing like that. A lot of them, some of them did, a lot of them didn't. And so this is a part of a war story too that we don't talk about. So on the one hand, Johnny's definition of a war story is very important because I think it is how most of us in the United States think of war stories, as some of you also gestured at, which are the stories that soldiers bring back from overseas of terrible things that happened to them or their friends, or terrible things that they did to other people. Either of those kinds of stories is traumatic. There's a lot of literature that talks about the trauma that soldiers experience because of what they see being done to their comrades or what happens to them, but also by killing people, that's traumatic too. Now that's the kind of war story I'm proposing to you that most Americans think of when they think of war story. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I think while that's very important, it's a very limited way of understanding war. And I'm going to use the Vietnam War as an example. Because go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that before I forget, my train of thought is weak. But unfortunately, a lot of civilians learn about different wars through television.
Yeah.
And that could be very harmful to veterans and for our nation. Because in the movies, they depict military soldiers doing naughty things, you know, like committing serious crimes against women
Yeah.
and killing people, as you said. There's not going to be a war on either side that they don't kill civilians or innocent people. That's the nature of war, which is a terrible thing. I don't believe in wars. I believe in negotiating. But these pictures do a lot of harm. And again, I warn people that don't listen to all that and don't pay attention to it too much because Hollywood's Hollywood. They'll do anything to anybody to make a movie and make money.
Yeah. And one thing I want to bring up about that is that a lot of people argue that these kinds of images and stories, which you've all seen, are effectively anti-war in their message. You see some terrible photograph, you see some horrible war movie, and obviously the message is war is hell. Therefore, we should not go to war. But what I'm going to argue is that's actually not true. I mean, it is in one extent. We obviously intellectually register that war is hell. But despite all of those terrible photographs and terrible war movies and terrible war stories, we still go to war. We've been to a lot of wars since the Vietnam War. So it seems that all those horrible stories haven't actually stopped us from going to war. And what I'm going to argue to you is that the reason why is because these war stories are spectacular. For the people who lived through them, they're horrible. But for the rest of us who are watching Platoon or Apocalypse Now or whatever, it's entertainment in the end. We can think that war is hell, but we still like to watch it on the movie screen. And it distracts us from the nature of war that's actually much more disturbing than killing and raping and all this other kind of stuff. All that stuff is terrible. But perhaps when we say war story, we should think about all of the other war stories that don't get included in the category of soldiers doing things. Because is it a war story for all those guys who were in the Vietnam War, American soldiers, who never actually saw any combat, they just sat around? Is that a war story? Is it a war story about the woman who marries a Vietnam vet with PTSD and they get divorced 20 years later? Is it a war story for the Vietnam vet who has a child that is deformed because he thinks it's because of Agent Orange that he suffered from during the war? Is it a war story about all of those people in Southeast Asia who were not soldiers, but who were shot at, who lost their homes, who were forced to flee, who became refugees, are those war stories. And of course my argument is all those are war stories. Because that's what war is. War is not a battle that takes place on the battlefield, not only a battle. War is systematic. It incorporates all of us. You pay your taxes, you just bought into a war. You don't have any choice, right? No one asks you if you want to pay your taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, you can go to jail. So whether or not you agree with any of the wars we're fighting now, or any wars we fight in the past, any wars we fight in the future, we're all implicated in war. That's a war story. And that actually, I would argue, is much more disturbing because you don't see movies about that. You don't see movies saying, okay, you paid $5,000 in taxes this year, that means you bought a part of a missile that was shot into someone's home and killed some innocent people. But that's part of the war story. And it's a much more powerful war story because it gets all of us to agree to participate in war industries and war machineries that we might otherwise oppose on the surface. So Maxine Kingston, she has a story in a book called Chinaman. Maxine Kingston is a very important writer, and she's been an anti-war activist, but she has a book called Chinaman about Asian Americans, Chinese immigrants. One chapter is called The Brother in Vietnam. So her brother has to go to Vietnam, he serves on a Navy ship. And she said he never did anything there. But she says that for her, during this time of the 1960s, turning on the refrigerator, buying Wonder Bread, using a computer, all this stuff, in her opinion, participated in the war. Because they were all of these commodities and products and experiences are tied into a military-industrial complex in which it's very difficult to do anything that doesn't in some way support corporations, governments, and so on that are using those kinds of profits to pay for the war. So that is the kind of war story that I'm interested in. I mean, not just Johnny's war story I'm interested in too, but interested also in the totality of war stories that get us to think about our implication in a war, and also get us to think about how people elsewhere experience war. So your example that war stories are something that soldiers bring back from overseas and tell civilians here, I think it's a very American conception of the war story. It's true, but it's a very American conception. Because the Americans have had the luxury of fighting all the 20th century wars elsewhere, except for 9/11. Right? That's the one, 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. And these two events stay in our mind because we're shocked that someone would bomb us. But for the experience of the rest of the world, most of the time people are getting bombed. It doesn't matter if they're soldiers. So for other countries, especially as we see with Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the experience of the war is not about soldiers or only about soldiers, but actually about everybody. So that's why when we talk about how war stories differ from the United States to Southeast Asia, one of the very key differences is that here in the United States, mostly we pay attention to the stories of war soldiers, war stories of soldiers. So the other kinds of stories are very exceptional. There's a few stories about nurses, there's a few stories about PTSD, there's a few stories about people like Wes who inherited trauma and stories from fathers who never speak of the war, right? Secondhand trauma, secondhand memories. But if you look at Southeast Asia, as we're going to talk about today, what you discover is that the war stories in Southeast Asia are oftentimes not about soldiers, they're about families. Because imagine what would happen if you're a family, your father has to go, is drafted to go to war, he doesn't want to go to war, you're staying at home, but then rockets fall on your house and you're forced to flee to a refugee camp, and then people get raped and murdered. These are the kinds of stories that characterize Southeast Asians. So in my class, my students do these interviews. When they interview Americans, most of the stories are boring, because most Americans just witnessed it from afar or sat on a base somewhere, and a few of them saw combat. When they interview Southeast Asians, all the stories are horrible. Because for Southeast Asians to make it here to the United States to be interviewed, it meant that that they themselves or their parents had to undergo horrible, terrifying experiences, either there during the war, or as boat people, or whatever other kind of refugee experience to make it to the United States. Those are war stories too, but they're fundamentally different. So that's important to convey, I think, because again, when we talk about war stories in the American context, Americans are very ethnocentric and nationalistic about the war story, because they're only, for the most part, interested in their own war stories and the stories of their soldiers. By the way, if you disagree with anything I'm saying, or you have another opinion or a question, just raise your hand or just interject in case you don't agree. But this is the argument I'm putting forth, that Americans are invested in a certain kind of war story. And it blinds them to the fact that how the rest of the world experiences wars, especially the people that we are fighting against, is radically different. So even now, with post 9/11 wars that we've had, when we are exposed to war stories, it's almost completely about the American soldier and what he or she now is going through, right? You have very little sense of how these wars are experienced by the people we're either fighting against or supposedly fighting for. And in many ways, that's a repetition of what happened during the Vietnam War, except worse. Because at least during the Vietnam War, there was media coverage of what was happening in Southeast Asia, and so Americans were getting some of these glimpses of what were happening to the Southeast Asians, and that was one of the reasons why there was a strong anti-war movement. And we, as a lesson, one of the lessons that the U.S. government had from that is not to give the media access to what is happening in these foreign wars. So we don't get the stories, for the most part, of what is happening in Afghanistan or Iraq or other kinds of places. Okay, so that's one frame for understanding what I'm going to talk about, this totality of the war story. The other frame is the question of why we should remember. Why do you think it's important to remember these war stories? Presumably you think it's important, that's why you're taking the class. You want to know something about the past, something about this particular history. But tell me and tell us, why do you think it's important to remember the past? John.
I don't see any hands, so I'll take it. I think it's very important that we understand all wars to prevent them from happening again and to try to understand the pain it causes to the people. The homeland is being destroyed. And like you mentioned, families, children. And I think PTSD plays a big part in that. Not only the Vietnamese people on both sides, but the American fighting men who lost their legs and their lives. And doing things like you mentioned, the Air Force, well, the Army did a lot of rescue and preventing injuries to the Vietnamese people. A lot of them got killed helping those people. They gave their lives. And the American people, to my understanding, what I hear and see and understand is that the Vietnam veterans' family suffers real bad too. Suffers real bad. So there's no good war, you know?
Okay,
But I especially feel for the people.
So let me ask you and everybody else this question, right? I'm going to show you some slides of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. It commemorates 58,000 plus American soldiers who died during the war. Why do we have any memorials that talk about what Johnny just talked about, which is, for example, PTSD, homeless veterans, the fact that I think more veterans have killed themselves than have died in the Vietnam War? I don't know, that's one statistic that floats around. In other words, more soldiers killed themselves after the war than were killed in the war. Right? There's no memorial to them. There's no memorial to PTSD victims. There's no memorial to all the divorces that happened. There's no memorial to unhappy children. Why? We're perfectly happy to want to remember 58,000 American dead